Hey, so I am going to take a few minutes to show you a couple of ways that I have come up with to pair the my modular setup that I have, which is very simple. It's basically a couple of voices with the M8, the Dirtywave M8 tracker. So what I will share with you today largely will reference my specific modular setup, but honestly, as long as you have something that can interpret MIDI into CV, if you have another module or if you have a nifty case, even if your setup isn't exactly the same, what I'm going to share is going to apply. And honestly, I anticipate hopefully sharing some tips that will be helpful for you using other external synthesizers with your Dirtywave M8 as well. Really anything where you can send MIDI CC, you can come up with some really interesting ideas and expand the functionality of the synthesizers that you have beyond what they might already be able to do. The Dirtywave can do many things, but one of the nice things is it's got multiple modulation sources. Of course, you can control volume, and there's extra filters that you can apply to external instruments, and you also have FX and so many cool things that you can do, especially once you get into tables. And so there's just a ton of different things. I'm going to try to keep it focused. This is not meant to be an exhaustive guide, but just to help give you an idea of some places that you can start and just some ideas that I have come up with. Definitely am not an expert here, very much still learning both modular and the Dirtywave, and there may be things that I am telling you that may not be 100% correct, in which case leave a comment, let me know. Definitely eager to learn myself, but here's some things that I've come up with. I will try to explain a little bit what I've done here with this rat's nest here. It's actually relatively simple, and I will try to walk through some of the ideas that I've had with the Dirtywave. So just to give you an idea of something that you can come up with, I'm just going to go ahead and play a quick little sequence that I have for you right now, which actually has two separate voices sending into two separate channels on the M8. They are both feeding into the reverb and the delay, but they are applied in different ways. And so, I'll explain how I do that in a little bit more depth in just a second. All right, so very simple on one hand. On the other hand, there's some interesting and complicated things that are happening. So let's start with our first voice. So let's start over here with track 1. So what I did, basically, I have just a chromatic scale. I just wanted to quickly enter in things that I knew were going to sound okay no matter what I did, and a couple things. So first, let's go into the instrument. So I used an external instrument. And one thing I did here is I used line and left. Now you're probably going to want to do line and left or right either way, depending on your modular setup. I know mine only sends mono. And so you'll want to, actually no, I should say mine I do think sends stereo, but I only, in this case, had audio going into the left channel. So you'll want to do that. Otherwise, you will only be getting mono audio out of one channel on the M8. And then you'll want to set your channel appropriately. So for the nifty case, basically, if you want to send out of just the first pitch and gate, it's channel 1, second it's channel 2, both channel 3, and then you can also send clock, which I don't really do a whole lot of in my modular setup, and then you can send mod, which we're definitely going to use. So I did set this up ahead of time, so hopefully you understand a little bit about modular so you can parse this rat's nest that I've done. But basically, this voice is fairly straightforward. I'm sending the pitch here into the pitch on the Behringer 110, and then I have my gate going into a buffered mult, and which I am then sending into the abacus, which I'm using as two attack release envelopes, basically. And then I'm using those to modulate the VCF and the VCA of this voice. Actually, and for this one, what I'm doing, just for clarity, is I'm actually sending the VCA out directly out of the module. I'm not going through the nifty case into the M8. And one thing that I'll talk about a little bit more later, but I have this left-right channel splitter. And so one thing I will say is do this slightly at your own risk. I think you'll want to be careful and make sure if you do anything like this that you are using an appropriate out. I probably wouldn't recommend going out of the high output. Again, not an expert here. I'm sure that there is someone who could tell you why that is a bad idea, and maybe I'm wrong. I just would not recommend doing that, and I would do this carefully, because when you're playing with Eurorack, you just never know exactly what level something's coming out, or you do. I don't. So just be careful with that. But that's why I am using the low. And then I'm sending that in, and then I have basically I've got chorus, some delay, some reverb from the M8, and then I just turned up the delay send into the reverb just because I like the sound of it a little bit more. And I turned up the reverb decay, but this is what this sounds like it's on its own. There's another piece. There's another thing that's happening that I'll talk about in a second. So one other thing that I did is I assigned CCA to MIDI CC MIDI CC value 1, and so that otherwise that would be what your mod wheel would send. And I did that specifically with the Nifty case because when you send mod wheel, it comes through this mod output up here, and so you can use that actually as an attenuation source or modulation source, I should say. And so by default, I have this value set to 0, and you can do things with LFOs, with envelopes. You can do things with the trigger envelope. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But one thing I did is I actually added an auxiliary table just to show something in a second. But yeah, you can use that as a modulation. So for example, you can send this into the VCF as another modulation source. So you can have you can have the VCF modulated by the envelope, and then you could have that, for example, plucked on top to give it a little bit of a syncopated effect. But I also wanted to show one thing that you can do with that is you can actually send values that will trigger things that are binary. So on my Abacus, which is a clone of the Make Noise Maths, which is an excellent module, and one of the things that the Make Noise and the Abacus have is they have the ability to trigger this cycle on or off. And so basically once you send CC of a certain value, or CV of a certain value, I should say, CV is being converted into, or CC is being converted into CV here, the MIDI values are being converted into CV, it actually triggers that to turn on. And so there's a couple things that you can do with that, but just to show you, I don't know if you can see, but you can see I have this table here, and in the table, in certain steps, I am sending CC that is sufficiently high when in CV to trigger. And so whenever that is triggered, it turns this on, which in this case causes the envelope to loop. This is just how the maths or the Abacus work, if you're familiar. But so this is something that you can do. You can use tables or LFOs or various different things to cause certain things to trigger. So for example, let's say I wanted my LFO on my LFO module to trigger. I have a trigger input here, and so I can take the mod out of here and put it in here, and every time it reaches a certain point, whether it's because my LFO reaches a certain point or my envelope or whatever it is, whenever I send a sufficient value, it is going to trigger whatever I am putting in. And so for this, it's actually kind of neat. What it's doing is it's causing it to, we're playing this little sort of ARP, and then every once in a while, when it loops, it's causing that quick envelope to loop fast. It turns it into sort of an LFO, which is giving it that little sort of re-triggering sound that you might hear. So yeah, so you can use that mod source as just another modulation. You can use that. One thing I really like to do with that is I am a very big fan of the I think it's the reverse sawtooth, or what the M8 calls the ramp down LFO type. Really, really like that. And I have a lot of synths that don't have that LFO type. Maybe they just have a sine wave. Maybe they just have a square wave. Maybe they have the sawtooth where it just is a ramp up. And so I really like using that ramp down. And I can have that with my synths that don't have that by sending that with my M8 through CC to modulate the VCF or whatever it is that I want to modulate in that way. So yeah, so again, if you have a module, or you're using the Nifty case or something else where you can translate CV into CC separate from just pitch and gate, that's another modulation source where you have all of those envelopes, you have all those LFOs. So again, a ton of different things. This is not meant to be exhaustive. Of course, your own synths, your own modular setup maybe completely different, but just some creative ways that you can think of using what you can send out of the M8. And then, yeah, I mean, I also just, for me, you know, I really have a very lightweight, modular setup. You know, I don't really have much in the way of FX. I don't actually even have a ton of VCAs, really. Mostly what I have is two, actually, technically, anyways, I don't have to get into it, but I've got a few full voices. That was what I was looking for now, at least. And the M8 gives me more of a full rig without having to buy more modules that either would have cost me a lot of money, but also would have been difficult to fit into limited space. The Nifty case only has about 84 HP. So yeah, that is something that you can do. Beyond just sending pitch and gate, you can also use the M8 as an additional modulation source, and I love it. It's a ton of fun, and it's a cool way to get you know, easily reproduced modulations out of your modular or other synths that you can use with the M8, especially in like a live environment where you don't want to just be using the M8 potentially, and you want to be using other synths. That's something that you can do to have things sort of pre-sequenced ahead of time while still giving you room to play and tweak knobs and things like that. So let's talk about some other things that you can do. So one of the things that I have discovered with the M8, and this is not just true with modular, this is true generally, but that I'd like to point out is you can have multiple external instruments. Now, I wish I could say I came up with this entirely on my own. I had an inkling of an idea, and I did ask some questions of some folks in the M8 Discord who are always very willing to help. Definitely encourage you to join. It's a great group of folks, and they are very happy to answer a variety of questions. And I may even chime in and try to answer your question, maybe incorrectly, myself. But one of the things that I found that was really cool is if you get a particular splitter like this, and this is different to most splitters that you might find, but a splitter that truly separates your left and right audio channel, you can bring in two instruments into the M8. So what I've done here, if you can see, is I've got the low VCA input coming out of this, the 110, and that is going into my white. I believe that's my left channel, could be wrong on that. And then what I'm doing on the Nifty case is I'm sending my audio out of my Erica Synths filter over here into the left channel. It doesn't really matter ultimately, but I'm sending mono audio out of the Nifty case into the red, or I believe it's the right channel. And so in my instruments here, you'll see I've got line in left, and then on my other one, I've got line in right. And so when I play them both, you see, you know, I've got that one sequence running, and then on this one, I've got the other, and I can have them both going at the same time. And I can even do things, for example, like let's say I don't want the reverb, I can add it, or I can crank it, and I can do that independently. It's not like I have to choose between one or the other. So let me turn that down a little bit. It's a little too much. But yeah, you can have two completely separate synths, mono, of course, but coming into the M8. And you know, you can give them more width by giving them more chorus. You can add an amp to make them a little crunchier. Didn't really do very much in that case, but there's various things you can do. And one thing that's really nice with the M8 is the M8, I think I mentioned this earlier, can basically function as a VCA, sort of. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to assume you generally understand synthesis setup, but just in case you don't, for a full voice, there's a couple of things that you need, basically. You need an oscillator, so that would be like over here or over here. You generally, for most subtractive synthesis, need a filter of some sort, generally a low-pass filter, and then you need a VCA, a voltage-controlled amplifier. I believe that's what it's stands for, but you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea being that you've got an oscillator which produces a pitch, you've got a filter which can shape that sound by removing certain frequencies, and then you've got an amplifier, which what then happens to have a complete voice is you you modulate those generally with envelopes. So you can use one envelope for both. You can use two envelopes. So I generally like to use two envelopes. I like to have one envelope going into my VCF, one envelope going into my VCA. And what happens is when I send gate, when I send pitch and gate, I send pitch, and that causes, when I send pitch CV into my oscillator, that causes it to send to produce a certain note. And then when I send gate, of course, it's multed, but it's going here into my envelope, and that's producing two envelopes of a particular shape and rate, which then go into these two pieces, the VCF and the VCA. And that causes the VCF to open in a particular way and the VCA to open in a particular way. So the VCF, it means the filter is moving, allowing certain higher frequencies to come out, or lower. Again, it depends on what kind of filter you're using. And with the VCA, it's causing it to actually amplify the sound that you're playing so that you can hear it. If you just took the pitch and put it right into your out, or not the pitch, but if you took your oscillator, I should say, and put it into your out, it would just be one loud continuous sound. Now, there are lots of other uses for VCAs, that there are others that are much more qualified than I am to explain, but you can use them as attenuation sources, and there's all sorts of things. But let's say that you don't have one. One thing I should say is if you don't have a complete voice, some of what I'm describing probably is not going to be super practical or easy for you. So for example, maybe you just got the Nifty case and then you got the Nifty bundle and you just have cells and you just have chips. What I'm sharing is still potentially going to be valuable to you, but you might find that you're going to get just as far, if not further, with just the internal engines on the M8. But if you have something that's a little bit more complete and you want another VCA, you can use the M8 for that. You can you can control the amp, you can control the dry, and basically you can control the volume with an attack, hold, decay envelope or an ADSR or whatever it is. You can modulate the volume with these envelopes, LFOs, everything that you have on the M8. And so basically, if you didn't, or if you wanted to use your VCA for something else, you could conceivably use the M8 as a VCA, potentially. You also can use this as another filter type. So for example, let's say that you've got a low pass filter, but you want to add in some high pass for more of a band pass effect. You can put in a high pass, and so you take down, let's see. Yeah, so you hear, I've got a low pass filter on this, but if I put in the high pass, that takes out some of those lower frequencies as well, giving you more of a band pass effect. There's a variety of different things that you can do, but basically it's not just that you can add an effect. It's not even just that it's another modulation source, but you can affect the sound further within the M8 by modulating the amplification in the M8, with different limiter types. You can modulate it, or you can affect the sound by changing the volume even further once it goes into the M8. And you, of course, can also add or change filters. So yeah, last thing I think for this part that I should mention is there are potentially even more things that you can do. When you use the external instrument type, which is what I'm doing, you can send 4 different CC values. I have heard that if you try to send too many different CC values over MIDI, certain modular setups can get confused. For me, it's pretty straightforward, and that mine basically, I'll just take pitch, gate, and then that mod wheel value. So I never really use more than just CC1, or CCA, I should say. But yeah, you can modulate that in multiple ways. You can modulate that with multiple LFOs or with a table and an LFO. There's multiple things you can use to modulate that at once. And if you're working with another synthesizer, you can, where you're just sending MIDI directly, you could modulate the frequency and the resonance and the release of an envelope or whatever. You can do multiple things at once. If you do use the MIDI out instrument, you have even more things that you can do. But for me, generally, I like to use external because I like to bring the audio back into the M8 where I can maybe sample it, or at the very least, I can control it with the various FX. And from my perspective, it helps glue my sound a little bit more as well, which is nice. Like, you can have it all be affected by the same limiter or things like that. So two more things I will show you quickly. One is a really simple, useful feature, and that's that you can use the M8 to tune your oscillators, which is really helpful if you have cheap oscillators that like to drift a lot, like mine, primarily the chips and the Behringer 110. What I learned on the Discord relatively recently is that if you have an external instrument going in, of course it shows the scope up top. And if the note that is going in is very different to what is being triggered, the scope will move quite a bit. But if you are in tune, the line in the scope will stay still. So this is probably not the best way to actually tune it the way that I'm doing it now. But as you can see, as I get more in tune, the scope stays relatively still. It's not, moving fast to either the right or to the left. So that's that. Then the last thing I did want to show you is the trigger envelope. I love the trigger envelope. The trigger envelope is a very useful feature on the M8 for ducking of various kinds. There's a ton of novel uses. I've even just gotten some ideas recently that I'd never thought of. So there's so much that you can do. But yeah, a really common way that I use it is to duck. For me, the way that I like to duck is I like to send trigger envelope into the VCF of whatever it is that I want to duck, rather than the volume, because I like leaving some of those low frequencies there, and I just like the sound that it gives. It helps take the bass or something out to make room for something like a kick without taking as much of the instrument out. So that's just how I like to do it. You can certainly do it just on the internal M8, but you can do it with external gear as well. And so how you would do that, so in this case, what I've done, this may not be the only way or even the best way to do it, but for me, I used my abacus for this. So I am sending basically every time right now without anything playing. You see my bass, or whatever you call it, plays. And I have my mod, which is based on the trigger envelope, going into this attenuverter channel on my abacus, which is attenuverting this signal into a negative one, because in my experience, when I tried sending a negative signal, so when, normally if I was doing this on the M8, I would have this line going the other direction, so that when there was a trigger in, the trigger envelope would decrease. It would, it would send the filter down, taking out frequencies. But I am not able to send negative CV in this way to my modular. And so I send positive values out from the trigger into my attenuverter, which is inverting it, which I then send as an additional modulation to my cutoff on this voice. So to give you a sense of what that sounds like, let me just let me get a separate line over here where you can hear what it sounds like. Let me take the other synth part out, and so that we just have the drums and the bass. And so if you go in, you should even be able to see what it's doing to the let's see, yeah. If you look, you can see that it is sending positive values, the trigger envelope, which again are being attenuverted, and then they are ducking our cutoff. You can change this in various ways. You can of course change the attack, the hold, the decay, the amount, and this only lasts as long as whatever it is that's triggering the trigger envelope plays. So if I just play this by itself, you see no trigger envelope, no ducking. So just something really useful and a nice way to accomplish some sidechain compression on or sidechain ducking in external gear without having to buy crazy expensive pedals or things like that. So if you want to have an external setup, what I've been putting together so far really actually just has two synths. I have been using my Behringer Model D, and just off screen here I have my JX08. In the same way that this is set up, I have those going into the M8 and all of my sound going out of the M8, and I'm basically mixing them on the M8. And so yeah, you can get some really cool things out of that that you otherwise would have to use a DAW or much more complicated or expensive gear to accomplish. So anyways, again, not an exhaustive list of things that you can do, but hopefully this is helpful to give you some ideas of some of the interesting things that you can do. You can take multiple voices into the M8 at once, multiple synths even at once, where you're sequencing two things at once, bringing them in with separate effects sends. You can send modulation through CV, and then if you have the right modular case or whatever your modular setup is, if you can accommodate converting CC into CV, you have another modulation source where you get a bunch. You get per track you get 4 extra filters, and if you wanted to get crazy, you could even stack multiple things. How that'll work for you, I don't know. But yeah, you can bring things into the effects, into the other ways that you have to shape and affect your sound in the M8. And yeah, you can use that to sample and then play with those samples in your M8, or you can use this in a live environment. But yeah, there's so many things that you can do. Again, this is just a pretty simple modular setup, not even a very complicated one, but you can get so much more out of this just by pairing this with a device like the M8. And one of the other things that's really fun is, you can use the M8 just to compose things, and then you can easily throw your modular in. So, I very much could see this being something where, you write a song on the M8 with a part that you sort of rebuild on your modular rig each time so that it's a little different if you want some variety in your performances. But yeah, these are just some ideas. Hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions or honestly any ideas. I'm definitely still learning here very much myself, but I am enjoying this quite a bit. Cool.